Welcome back, and it has been a bit of time since we last did a podcast. That's because Paul just got lazy and didn't want to do anything. Or
let's talk about the real reason.
there have been some pretty good reasons. Thank you to everybody for the prayers for my family. It's my father's death a little over 3 weeks ago. For the time, thank you, Paul, for coming up to the funeral, and just thank you for your friendship in that. And everybody's been so supportive, so very much appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a tough time, and being able to journey with you through that a little bit certainly reminds me how much I miss my parents, and just the importance, I think, of always valuing, even though the relationships with parents aren't always smooth and easy. Man, you love your folks and you are grateful for them. And I think you never know quite how much you're going to miss them until you miss them.
Yeah, it's all so new. It's just going to take a while.
Yeah.
And I know, and you've undergone losing both of your parents in the very recent past, and it's a different world.
Yeah.
But I do, again, thank you for all the prayers, the cards. I've got a stack of cards. It's unbelievable, the outpouring of support that I've received from this congregation. So thank you. And thank you for being back with us as we're now on the other side of Easter. We stepped out of the Bible year to honor the liturgical dates of Palm Sunday, Triumphal Entry, Maundy, Thursday, Holy Friday, all those things, of course, in the celebration of Easter. And so now we're wanting to get back on track with our Bible in the year, and we're into what we want to talk about today would be Nehemiah, Ezra, and Job. I know the readings have the congregation in the book of Psalms. And the book of Psalms are awesome. We'll get there. We'll catch up with you. But we just need to do a little bit of backtracking from the Psalms to talk about Ezra, Nehemiah, and Job, and set the stage for where we are in Scripture.
So rough and dirty, the Scriptures are in something like a chronological order, except there are...
except when they're not.
Except when they're not. And the books of Ezra and Nehemiah today that we talk about, those are part of the post-exilic period. We've touched on in previous podcasts this time when Israel is invaded, carried off into exile. Ezra and Nehemiah take place about 50 years. So 587 BC was when the Babylonians came, finally destroyed the temple, destroyed Jerusalem. 50 years later, approximately, is when the process of allowing them to come back, the exiles, some will return, and the process of rebuilding starts.
And they're not exact dates because it's not like everybody came back at once. It was a slow trickle. Yeah. We're so used to modern ways of thinking, modern transportation. It's not like they got on a bus and just went home. So Ezra and Nehemiah, as Paul said, do deal with the aftermath of devastation. The Jerusalem's destroyed. This amazing temple that Solomon built, that was the wonder of the world, is gone. It's just a heap of garbage, a bunch of rocks strewn about. The walls of Jerusalem have been broken down. There's no identity. There's no, it's a refugee camp, if anything. And it's not just the Jewish people who are there. They're intermingled with all these other people who've been cast off from other nations. So it's a real hodgepodge of people. It's a mess.
And so long about 533 BC, the Persian king issues a decree and says that some of the exiles led by Ezra can go back to Jerusalem and begin the process of rebuilding.
And this is important because you got to remember, there was the Babylonian Empire. They fall to the Persian Empire. The Babylonians were all about brute force, shock and awe. They're going to raise everything to the ground. Well, the Persians had a little bit different governing philosophy, that if they would rather have client states than defeated states, meaning that they would allow an individual people to maintain some of their identity as long as they were faithful and true to their overlords.
Mm-hmm.
And so they didn't really care that the Jews went home. Actually, they probably wanted them to go home.
Actually funded part of the trip back, funded the opportunity for them to have some of the materials that they would need to begin the process of rebuilding. So
that's the political lens. But the theological lens is God is restoring, God is rebuilding.
God is fulfilling the promise that he made, that though this would be a dark time in the history of the people called Israel,
a remnant would remain, and from that remnant I will bring back my people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of, and I hope you remember how this all started with the person of Abram, who was described as one who was as good as dead, that God brings forth a people really out of nothing. Well, it's happening again.
So these stories do tend to repeat themselves. It is out of the most unlikely of circumstances God can bring and do about what God chooses. And fortunately for the people, God does choose to restore. God fulfills the promise that God made to Abram, that this land and this area, you will own it forever.
But it is not an immediate restoration.
Right. It is a slow, long process.
It's slower than widening Highway 150 and 73.
Oh, now come on! Nothing takes that long.
That's generations.
Yeah.
That is that kind of idea. Those of you who've built a house or done anything know that the timeline, you see, you have a vision for what you want, but the timeline can get really drawn out for various reasons.
So think about this. It's been 50 years since the destruction, and then so we've got the first edict. Think about 50 years, even in our history. Go back to the 1960s now. What we've got is
actually
a lot of
now
people,
you only have to go back to
1975.
1975.
Yeah, right. 1975. Yeah, my math's not great, is it? So a lot has happened, and a lot of people have resettled from other places in these places that would be normally known as Jerusalem, where the temple would. So when the exiles come back, they're not coming back to an empty space. They're coming back to places that people have occupied for these years, who now consider this our territory, and they are quite resistant to the rebuilding job. And Nehemiah runs into quite the opposition.
Right. And so you get Ezra and Nehemiah. These are kind of companion documents in the Jewish canon, and they are often put together. And Ezra comes back is almost like a shepherd leader in that he nurtures the people. He reestablishes the law. Well, Nehemiah comes in, and he's kind of a rougher, tougher type of guy, and he's more of a construction manager. His job is to rebuild the walls, and there's again, as Paul said, there's a lot of opposition to this from the population who had settled there, and so Nehemiah can be a really difficult text in some places, but you also have to remember we're still in the ancient world. We're still 500 years before the birth of Jesus, and it's a tough time to live. And so there's a lot of tough things that happen in Nehemiah. Things like telling the people, if you've married someone who's not Jewish, you've got to leave them.
You've got to put away that foreign wife,
because there had been a lot
to the covenant,
right? And so you have to be really careful with Nehemiah, because at times people have used Nehemiah to justify racism, at racial purity, which is just a ridiculous idea in the modern world. You can misread and misconstrue Nehemiah to get there, and it's been done. So we want to be very careful with that. But what Nehemiah, the purpose of Nehemiah and what God's doing is to reestablish his people in the land that had been promised to them. And that takes a long time. And we also have to remember that the people of Israel, they never were much of an actor on the international stage. Maybe a blip on the radar when David was king, and a little bigger blip when Solomon was king, but they're really just nobodies.
Yeah.
So, but yet that's who God uses. And that should be a powerful lesson to us, that sometimes we think, well, I'm not super rich, I'm not even rich. I'm not super well. Paul thinks about it. Paul told me just today. He's like, I'm not super smart, and I said, yeah, you're right, but God still uses you. So we deal with that from time to time.
Yeah, we both relate to that pretty well, don't we? So as we make the transition from Ezra and Nehemiah, we're
God
gonna
rebuilding,
get
right?
back to this loop in a little bit when we get into the prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel. We're gonna have to come back to the material before the exile.
And that's part of that struggle with it not being in chronological order. And we are reading through the Bible in what we would call canonical order, just how the books are arranged.
Straight through.
And the Bible is arranged in canonical order for a reason. And sometimes it can be a little hard to understand because we're dealing with a book that's written from an Eastern mindset. Our Western mindset is A to B to C to D. Well, the ancient storytellers of Judaism, they would jump from A to Z back to J, then go over to T, and then back to B. It just moves around. So it does take a little more concentration to place where this is in the timeline, but it doesn't mean that the stories and the message has any less power or relevance for where we are today. So
in the middle, then, we have what is often referred to as wisdom literature of the scriptures. Included in the wisdom literature would be books like Psalms, Proverbs, and the book that I'm going to be focused on this coming Sunday at Huntersville, the book of Job. And I'm delighted that we get to spend a few minutes talking about Job, because when you look at the book of Job, you're really dealing with, in my estimation, where people live, the role of suffering, the role of just death, destruction, and where is God in the midst of that? And so Job really grapples with that.
And unsatisfactory answers to complicated questions.
Yeah. So when we start looking at the book of Job, my first thing I probably will say this Sunday is, if I could remove a book of the Bible, it probably would be Job, based on just my understanding. It is a book that really is quite disturbing on a number of levels, but especially that opening scene where Hasatan, Satan, the adversary, and God are almost like this conversation that feels very frivolous. Hey, I've got a really good guy, Job. Oh, well, if I mess with Job, he's going to curse you, God. Well, okay, I'll show you. You go ahead and do everything.
Well, and it's that idea. It's that idea. You start out, and it's almost it's more reminiscent of the Greek gods. That of being capricious and uncaring, and almost like we were talking a little bit before. It's almost like a mean kid looking into a terrarium thinking, how can I mess with the turtle down there? And so it starts out, I don't want to offend anyone, but that's just how it appears. But it starts out again in this weird conversation between God and Satan. The Satan is actually how it's written in the language. It is the one who brings accusation, like almost like a prosecutor in a court of law that says this is what you're guilty of. But and Satan's saying basically, oh, those people you created are all a bunch of losers. And God's like, well, what about Job? Look how he loves me. Look how faithful, how good he is. And the reply from Satan is, of course he loves you. You treat him like a favored pet.
Yeah, so we've got this story, and the fascinating part about Job is stories like Job about suffering, about the gods, appear in many different cultures, in many different types. Now, I hope nobody is offended by this, but this is my belief. I don't think we're looking at this is wisdom literature. This is not a story that's told that happened in 587 6 BC. I think this is a story. And it's part of this wisdom literature. I think it is meant to convey some things that we are to try to understand about God.
Send all emails to Paul B. Thompson at WNCCUMC.net.
Yes, you can be offended at me for that, but that's my belief.
But it's also resonates with our human reality that sometimes things happen we can't explain. And so, as the story moves ahead, that conversation. Of course, Job loves you. And then God goes, well, you do what you want. He's still going to love me. And Satan's like, well, all right. And it's like, but don't hurt him physically. Right. And then these horrible things start happening to Job.
His wife dies, his children die, his farm hands die, his animals die. Everything is removed from Job. It's like
and then eventually his physical
cascading horrible event.
And then eventually his physical health.
Yeah, so the Satan comes back and says, well, he didn't curse you because you didn't really get personal. If you start affecting his health, that's when it'll happen.
And that's what the kind of the bet is. If you let me have my way with him, he'll curse you.
Yeah.
And
all of that is just, again, on the surface, we look at that and we think, man, if that's how God works, I'm not sure about that. So, but it's the story, and in the story, eventually, even Job's health is impacted. He's lost everything that he has, and then his health is impacted, and he's sitting there with boils and sores and all sorts of bad stuff. And then maybe worst of all, Job's friends show up.
Well, at first they do. It's nice of them to show up.
They do show up, and we often are comforted by the presence of people in times of hurt and pain. But boy, if you've got friends like Job, get some new friends.
Well, it's when they open their mouth that things go sideways.
Yeah. So, having studied the book of Job an awful lot, what you have to find is this Deuteronomic theology is just prevalent.
You need to redefine that. It's been a while since we talked about Deuteronomy.
So Deuteronomic theology is when we sin, God punishes. When we do good, God blesses and rewards. So that whole system is clear in the Old Testament that was their belief system.
It's also easy to understand because it's black and white, binary, whatever you want to call it. It's a very simple system that's easy to understand unless you're in Job's position where you're like, I didn't do anything.
So Job's friends, they just simply say, Job, if you'll confess that sin, we'd really like to know what it is, just out of curiosity, but if you'll confess that sin and get it out front, maybe God will relent and help you.
We have to also, this does tie back to Ezra and Nehemiah because the people had returned, they were being obedient, but they weren't prospering. Right. So the idea is, if you're not prospering, then you must be doing something wrong. So that's part of how Job ties into that post-exilic literature.
And a lot of this wisdom literature is, if you were at Huntersville this past Sunday, we talked about the book of Esther. Who knows, but you were put here for such a time as this. It's, where is the presence of God in the world? Do things happen by just plain luck, circumstance? Is God involved in the day-to-day activity of humankind? Or is there some mystery of God is present, but not always doing the puppet string of making things happen? Where is God in the midst? So the book of Job dives hard into this question of God. And then by the time we get through all of Job's suffering and the conversations with Job's friends that are particularly disturbing for me, then we get this ending, Steve, that it is quite disturbing again on my part.
Yeah, so Job defends himself against his friends and says, I've not done anything. And then he takes his complaint to God.
God, if you'll just pick up the phone and answer me, you'll recognize that I haven't done anything to deserve this. And if you'll just listen to me, you'll recognize that this is unfair, unjust, wrong, and you need to go about fixing it. And then we get to chapter 40, 41, 42, where God says, I'm God and you ain't.
Yeah. How's that for theology?
That's pretty mountain.
Straight to the point
right there. Yeah, God says, Job, listen, I don't remember where you were. Were you there when I laid the foundation of the earth, when Leviathan I created, when all of this stuff that I've done in the world? Job, were you there? It's very sarcastic.
Well, it's to contend with God is part of our human nature, but it's also God's place to put us in our place.
And God says to Job, you stand up there, son, talk to me. Tell me what you think, and then we get into all this, we run into a little bit in the New
Well,
Testament.
in
When
30,
can the
I like this in
clay say
39,
to the potter?
right. In 39:7, gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you declare to me, like, okay, Job, it's on.
Yeah.
And guess what, Job? You're ill equipped to take me on because, and I think there's something about, I actually like the book of Job.
I knew there was something wrong with you.
Well, it's that mountain thing. It's like when you're just, things are bad to go bad sometimes. So may as well get through them. But that idea that sometimes we make God so small, sometimes we make God so personal that we start controlling what God does. And again, I'm going to lean on one of my favorite theologians, Walter Brueggemann, who says there's a wildness to God in that just can't be tamed. And we try to domesticate the God of the universe to fit into our mindsets, our logic, and our systems. And God will never do that. God won't fit into any theological system. I don't care how sound it is, or how well thought out it is, or how systematic it is. If God's God, God doesn't care about our logic. He doesn't care about how things may make sense to us or not, because God operates on a completely other plane and level in existence that is just absolutely beyond us. And yet the greatest expression we have of God and who God is the person of Jesus Christ. That's good news. That's good news because what we see in Jesus is personal and relational and hopeful and forgiveness and grace and redemption. But I still think that if we just lose this idea that there's aspects of God that are so far beyond us, we'll lose our ability to be at the whims of mystery.
So, yeah, I'm holding up Steve's Bible, recognizing that the fullness, all 66 books, is a revelation of God. We have the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. Sometimes it is quite difficult for me to reconcile both of those. But I think and Steve is offering a really helpful and important reminder that the entirety of the Bible has to be looked at as far as if we want to understand who God is. And God can do what God pleases.
Right. Even if it contradicts our logic.
Yeah. But we do recognize that God is faithful, that God is gracious, loving, all of those things that we hope and believe and trust about God. And yet, man, we have to look at the fullness of this and to say that God's ways are not our ways. God's ways are higher.
Well, and that we are mere children in our development compared to who God is. I know as a kid, there's so many times I didn't understand some of the decisions my parents made. I thought we should be able to have ice cream and birthday cake every night. If that would have been what I chose, right? I didn't understand why I couldn't have everything I wanted.
Well, on an even broader scale, I would never lose anybody I've loved.
No.
Right. They'd all be around forever, and I'd be happy about that. I would never go through any personal pain or struggle or a challenge, but then how much would I grow? So I'm painfully aware that in this mystery of who God is, there is always the struggle, the challenge. It is going to be there. It is necessary for us to grow. It is necessary for the things of life that we don't want to deal with them. So this book forces us really into a deeper conversation about the purposes of God. What is it that God is doing in the world? And the ending, I think, fascinating. Steve, how does the book end?
Well, at least in the Bible, as it's written, everything is restored to Job. But understand, his wife wasn't resurrected. He gets a new wife and a new family and new cows and dogs and all of that. But
which, if any of us say, hey, we'll give you the option, we're going to kill off your wife, children, family, all that. Oh, but you're going to get a new one. None of us. It's like, no,
Mm.
that's
And
not the plan we
and
want.
there's a lot of debate and scholarship around whether that's really how the book ended originally or not.
Mhm.
There's a possibility, and my own personal thinking is that a high possibility that some scribe along the way just couldn't tolerate that Job ended with God putting Job in Job's place, and that's it. So again, because it again, I just wonder about that. And again, there's a lot of different theories on that, a lot of different scholarship on that. But at the end of the day, there's no replacing someone that you've lost.
So
And
when we place this book, as it rightly is, in amidst the wisdom literature, amidst the Psalms and the Proverbs and the Book of Esther and even Ruth and some of these other books, really we get a full picture of the human experience. This book is important in the Bible in the fact that it challenges us to think and rethink about where is God on an everyday basis. When you lose your job, when you go to
mhm.
the doctor, when you face the death of someone you love or your own mortality, these books are there for a
and,
reason.
and so many things we can handle them when they make sense. And I do miss my dad. My dad lived to be 83 years old. So when his death is it it I have a friend whose father, she was 12 years old when her dad died. That's a different story
Yeah.
than my dad died at 83 after I had him, of course, 55 years. She had her dad 12 years. That's a different story. And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with, gosh, you hear it every day. Um, and there, some of it is there are some answers that we just don't get. And that can be really hard for a scientifically minded people. And yes, we are all scientifically minded, whether we know it or not. In our post enlightenment world, we think we can figure everything out.
Yeah. We think
If we
there's
just think hard enough, if we reason correctly, we can answer all of the worst, hardest, most difficult, pressing questions ever. And what Job tells us is no, you really can't. There are limits to human knowledge and understanding. Um, and that's hard for us to come up against because well, we don't like to think that there's any limits on our knowledge and understanding, but yet there is. And Job just kind of puts it in our face and says, where were you when God laid the foundations of the earth? Who are you to second guess the one who brought all life into being? So yeah, it's just a hard book, challenging. It does push the envelope of your spiritual and emotional and intellectual ability to comprehend, and in that way, it stretches our imagination and stretches our spirits, and that's always a good thing, even though it's a hard thing.
So as you're reading through this book, and thankfully it's about 5 days worth of reading that you get
And if you're
to
up on
the
your
end of
reading,
it.
you're already done.
Yeah. So just I hope we'll be talking about that book at Huntersville on Sunday. And where are you going at
I'm
Denver?
gonna spend a little time in Nehemiah, talking about restoration, and what I love about Nehemiah is how you know God God doesn't need much to work with
Mm-hmm.
to do incredible things. And then the next week we'll be in Job. I know that's on Mother's Day, probably not the best Mother's Day sermon material for Job, but that's where we are.
So just a reminder to the folks at Huntersville, this is first Sunday. So we call it a Unity Sunday. We invite you to come about 9:30, and there will be food and fellowship ahead of the service. Service that begins at 10 o'clock. We will be celebrating the sacrament of Holy Communion together as a congregation. Going to be a couple of important announcements at the end. I hope that you're there for those. And tell me about
Boy,
Denver.
that's a I want to know what those are.
Oh,
Maybe
there's
maybe you tell.
most of the people announced to their congregations last week what their plans were. We're
Okay,
gonna.
all right. Well, at Denver, 9 and 11, and we will have communion at both services. So, and we did announce last week I'll be back for year number 10. Yeah, 10
Number
years.
10 years.
Getting ready to hit the decade. Pastor David is coming back for year 4 under appointment, and Pastor Ben for under appointment year 4 also. So,
Man, we are so blessed, both of us, to have really awesome people to work with, and I'm grateful for your folks. I'm grateful for my folks.
so thank you, and we look forward to seeing you Sunday.
Thank you.